Parkersburg, West Virginia, Friday, March 19, 1965. The time, approximately 2 a.m., a typically cold, late winter morning along the Ohio River. At the Burger Boy Food-O-Rama on Ann Street, 18-year-old Garry Ross Cowdery is finishing up his shift by tabulating the day's receipts. With approximately $700 to deposit, Garry leaves the restaurant via the rear door and heads for his car. Moments later, gunshots pierce the chilled air. Garry Cowdery was struck by 4 bullets and died almost instantly. And 57 years later, his murder remains one of the oldest unsolved homicides in the state of West Virginia.
What price life? In the case of Garry Ross Cowdery, the figure was $700. $700 in the life of an up-and-coming young man was the killer's take for such a brazen act. While the motive for the robbery was plain to see, authorities were at a loss as to why such violent means were employed for such a modest amount of money. Was the killer simply crazed or deranged? Or could Garry Cowdery possibly have known his killer? The theory of an inside job is just one of many which has floated around Parkersburg since 1965, with the eerie specter of the so-called perfect crime looming larger with each passing year.
Garry Ross Cowdery was born in Parkersburg, West Virginia on August 20th, 1946, the fourth of 4 children born to John and Wilda Cowdery of Belpre, Ohio. In May of 1964, Garry graduated from Warren Township High School in Washington County, though he had previously attended Belpre High School, just across the river from Parkersburg. He and his family were members of the Calvary Community Church in Belpre, and Garry took his job at the Burger Boy Food-O-Rama in October of 1964. By all accounts, he was trusted and well-liked by his co-workers and supervisors. Founded by Milton Lusnauer and Roy Tuggle, Burger Boy Food-O-Rama opened its first location in Columbus in 1961. With an eye to taking on the ever-expanding McDonald's chain, Lusnauer and Tuggle opened a slew of new locations throughout the 1960s. By 1972, Burger Boy boasted 48 different locations across Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Their combination of cheap food along with indoor and open-air dining made them an attractive alternative to other fledgling chains in the comparatively new field of fast food. Surrounded by a parking lot between 8th and 7th Streets, the Burger Boy Food-O-Rama, where Garry Cowdery was employed, opened in 1964. Its strategic location along what was U.S. Route No. 50, along with its proximity to nearby Camden Clark Hospital, made the establishment a convenient location to both sup and congregate. Its iconic revolving rhodosphere served as its beacon and symbolized many of the aerospace advancements during the 1960s. Its glowing neon lights could be seen for blocks and would be a familiar sight in Parkersburg for over a decade. However, around 2 a.m. on March 19, 1965, the glowing spectacle would cast its neon lights upon a macabre scene. While an unidentified killer made off with the day's take, the life of Garry Cowdery slowly bled out onto the cold, sterile concrete. He had been shot not once, but 4 times. Although law enforcement and members of the press were on the scene almost immediately, the identity of Garry Cowdery's killer remains a mystery. By all accounts, Garry's workday on Thursday, March 18th, was routine. Garry worked as the restaurant's night manager and would typically be among the last of the staff to leave, shutting down and locking up as he left. Garry was also responsible for tabulating the day's intake of funds and output of expenditures. Cowdery was then responsible for transporting the sizable amount of cash to the night deposit of a nearby bank and then mailing the day's reports of business to the chain's office in Columbus. Typically, Garry would complete his computations and leave the restaurant with 1 or 2 other employees. That morning, however, Garry apparently closed and secured the restaurant some 15 minutes after the last 3 workers had departed. Whatever transpired after Garry exited the restaurant's rear door was not witnessed by any other Burger Boy employee or, as far as we can tell, anyone else save the killer. With no witnesses to the actual shooting, authorities turned their attention to reconstructing Garry Cowdery's known and surmised actions leading up to his death, working backwards from the estimated time of the shooting, approximately 2 a.m. Normal hours of operation ended at midnight, at which time all patrons and most of the Burger Boy staff left for the night. Garry, along with 3 other employees, remained behind to mop up and lock up. The 3 employees who stayed behind after closing are all believed to have departed the scene at approximately 1:45 a.m. Authorities noted that the restaurant's interior had been completely tidied up and wiped down. They also found a routine note for the morning shift left by Garry in the restaurant's office. In effect, it stated that everything was in order and no problems had cropped up. That day, Garry had parked his car roughly 20 feet from the restaurant's rear door, which faced in an easterly direction towards Juliana Street. Based on a ledger found inside, authorities were able to determine that Garry had exited the restaurant carrying approximately $700 in cash. The large number of bills would typically have been kept in a special money pouch for later deposit. The money pouch presumed to have held the $700 in earnings has never been found. It is believed that Garry exited the restaurant via the rear door at approximately 2 a.m. Being just 2 days shy of the vernal equinox, the night was clear but cold, with temperatures in the low 20s. Cowdery locked the rear door and is believed to have turned to his right and walked no more than a couple of steps. At about this time, workers outside the Parkersburg Sentinel building 2 blocks away heard a loud series of pops. It was later determined that at least 5 shots had been fired. 4 of the shots struck Garry Cowdery, who fell to the pavement. He was killed almost instantly. At least 1 shot went wild and struck a northern-facing window of the Esso service station just across 7th Street. A trio of ladies walking nearby also heard the shots and immediately called the Parkersburg Police Department. On desk duty at the nearby City Hall, Patrolman F.E. Fott took the call and ordered all available units to the scene. Moments later, the workers behind the Sentinel building observed an unidentified man run past in a southerly direction. Due to his movement and the low level of lighting in the area, the workers were only able to catch a faint glimpse of the man's face, and none of their descriptions were detailed enough to justify the creation of a composite. Authorities arrived at the scene within minutes. Among the first to arrive were Lieutenant Claire Snyder, along with Patrolmen Greathouse, Davis, and Denver. Radio, television, and newspaper reporters arrived close on their heels. Police Chief William Callaghan himself arrived at approximately 2:20 a.m. The scene they were met with was chilling. The proximity of Garry Cowdery's body to the rear door indicated he had been shot dead almost immediately after exiting the restaurant. Blood from Cowdery's wounds was still flowing out and down an incline leading from the raised walkway to the parking lot. A check of Garry's body revealed a large sealed envelope clutched tightly in his right hand. The envelope contained the daily report Garry had completed and was to have mailed to Columbus. Garry's wallet, containing an additional $70 in cash, was found in his back pocket, along with his uncashed paycheck. Just over 100 feet to the south, the window of an Esso service station was found to have been broken by one of the shots. The bullet was later recovered from inside the station's grease room. Once the scene had been secured and documented, Garry's body was removed by Shaver's ambulance to the nearby Camden Clark Memorial Hospital for an autopsy. Initially, it was thought that only 3 shots had struck Garry Cowdery. However, the coroner found that he had in fact been struck 4 times, once in the back, once in the left chest, once in the left shoulder, and 1 round had entered at the rear of the head. The killer's aim had been so true that the Wood County coroner later determined that any one of the 4 shots which struck Cowdery could have been fatal. Powder burns found on Garry's white shirt and skin indicated the shots had been fired at or close to point-blank range. The weapon was determined to have been a .38 caliber handgun, most likely a revolver, as no shell casings were reported to have been recovered. Spent rounds were removed and secured in hopes that ballistics might enable them to one day be matched to a specific weapon. The powder burns, combined with the location of Garry's body, only served to reinforce the supposition by authorities that he had been shot by someone who could not have been more than a few feet from the restaurant's rear door. It appeared that the killer had been laying in waiting for either Garry specifically or whomever left with the cash pouch. The scene now looked less like a run-of-the-mill murder-robbery and more like an ambush. A killer laying in ambush, 5 shots fired, a victim shot 4 times at close range, all for a take of less than $1,000? Authorities could only opine that the obvious overkill indicated that the killer feared being recognized by Cowdery and later identified. The killer had knowledge enough to know that a large sum of cash would be carried in the money pouch, yet apparently did not know or did not care that Garry Cowdery was carrying an additional $70 in his wallet. Could the killer have been someone who knew Garry, or someone who only knew that another someone would exit the Burger Boy Food-O-Rama carrying a sizable amount of cash? Indeed, from the outset, Parkersburg police surmised that the robbery and murders were not random acts of violence or crimes of opportunity. Someone had either done their homework very well or already knew the general work routine at the restaurant. Former manager Carl Eckert publicly opined that it may have been a, quote, inside job, end quote, by a Burger Boy employee or associate. Police Chief Callaghan did not disagree, and later expressed his own thoughts on the preciseness of the killing. Quote, "It's almost certain that the killer has been casing the restaurant and knew when an employee would leave to make a night deposit at the bank." Parkersburg Sentinel, March 19, 1965. As with any homicide more than half a century old, it is instructive to turn back the clock and show the crime scene and surrounding neighborhoods as they once appeared. Garry Ross Cowdery was shot here, at the rear of the Burger Boy Food-O-Rama, located at the junction of Ann and 7th Streets. The immediate neighborhood has changed considerably over the last 58 years, although the structure which housed the Esso service station remains. The site of the Burger Boy restaurant is now completely covered over by this modern medical office building. In 1965, the restaurant was virtually surrounded on every side by an expansive parking lot. At the time, this cluster of residential homes was situated immediately to the south on the opposite side of 7th Street and southwest of the present Parkersburg Community Bank. The low concrete wall and 2 sets of steps shown in this photo are still visible today. Other structures on the western side of Ann Street have since been replaced by a massive expansion of Camden Clark Medical Center. In 1965, the St. James Court alleyway continued north, past 6th Street, passed behind the cluster of homes, and into 7th Street. What would have been a continuation of this alley can be seen here, forming the eastern line of the Burger Boy's rear parking lot. The building, which still houses the Parkersburg Sentinel, now the Parkersburg News Sentinel, is still located here. Its rear entrance fronts directly onto St. James Alley. This modern structure at the corner of Juliana and 6th Street was not present in 1965, and would therefore have afforded a direct line-of-sight path from the parking lot behind the restaurant to the rear of the Sentinel building. Given the brutal and apparently calculated nature of the slaying, the Parkersburg Police Department launched an immediate round-the-clock investigation. By the end of March 20th, several so-called persons of interest had been questioned. Publicly, however, authorities stressed that no one had yet been questioned in the capacity of a suspect. Unbeknownst to the public at large, police had turned their attention to at least one former employee of the Burger Boy restaurant, a one-time co-worker of Garry Cowdery. However, with no eyewitnesses and no firearm to use for comparison, authorities soon found themselves well and truly stalled. They would not be unable to shift out of neutral until 40 years later. In 2002, the tactical unit of the Parkersburg Police Department began reviewing the 37-year-old case, applying methodology which was either unused or unknown in 1965. On February 26, 2004, Wood County prosecutor Ginny Connolly announced publicly that the Parkersburg Police Department had identified a suspect in the murder of Garry Cowdery. 16 months later, on July 29, 2005, 58-year-old Toby Michael Johnson was formally charged with Garry Cowdery's murder. Johnson, who was living in Ohio at the time, was taken into custody and held at the Delaware County Jail in Delaware, Ohio. Authorities made public that Johnson had been a suspect in the original investigation, yet they had lacked the necessary evidence to seek an indictment. With the advent of advanced ballistics, DNA, and fingerprint analysis, Parkersburg police believed they had at last overcome that hurdle. Johnson strongly protested his innocence, stating that he had been home in bed, fast asleep when Garry Cowdery was murdered. Modern forensics, however, do not trump the legal justice system. The U.S. Supreme Court had recently ruled that testimony from any witness who could not be cross-examined by either the prosecution or the defense was inadmissible. On July 31, 2006, a Wood County Circuit judge dismissed the indictment against Toby Johnson. Prosecutors hinted they might seek another indictment based on the remaining evidence. Johnson's attorney, Bill Kiger, was unimpressed, stating that the evidence against Johnson was slim at best. Neither Toby Johnson nor anyone else has since been formally charged with the murder of Garry Cowdery. Funeral services for Garry Ross Cowdery were held in the Calvary Community Church in Belpre, Ohio, on Monday, March 22, 1965. Reverend Clay Sloan of the Calvary Community Church in Belpre presided over the services. That same day, Garry Ross Cowdery was laid to rest in the Reedsville, Ohio cemetery. Over 57 years have now passed since the night Garry Cowdery was gunned down. Following the dismissal of the indictment against Toby Johnson, his case again slipped from the headlines and today remains just as it was in 1965, ice cold.
Authorities have never stated if any other suspects were ever considered in Garry Cowdery's murder. To date, Toby Johnson remains the only individual ever publicly named as a suspect. And it is important to remember that all charges against Johnson were dismissed, and he therefore must be considered innocent unless proven otherwise. Although the trail is once again cold, authorities have not forgotten about Garry Cowdery's murder. They would be interested in hearing from anyone who may have seen or heard anything during the early morning hours of March 19, 1965. Please pay close attention to the times and locations in the following summation.
Garry Ross Cowdery was shot and killed at approximately 2 a.m. on Friday, March 19, 1965. He had just exited the rear door to the Burger Boy Food-O-Rama at the corner of Ann and 7th Streets in Parkersburg. Authorities believe the incident unfolded very quickly and that Garry had taken perhaps 3 steps before he was shot. At least 5 shots from a .38 caliber handgun were fired, likely in quick succession. Garry Cowdery was struck by 4 bullets. One shot went wild and struck this window of Gay Looney's Esso station, indicating that the killer was probably facing to the south. The killer paused long enough to steal a cash pouch containing approximately $700 in cash. The bills were not marked or recorded in any way, and the cash pouch itself has never been located. For whatever reason, the killer did not pause long enough to steal Garry Cowdery's wallet or remove an envelope clenched in his right hand. Authorities remain convinced that the murder-robbery was not a crime of opportunity and that the killer had at least some knowledge of the work routine at the Burger Boy restaurant. They feel the killer either studied the activities of the Burger Boy employees or had inside knowledge of the normal closing procedures. They also feel it is likely that Garry Cowdery would have known his killer on sight and was purposely killed to avoid identification. While the movements of the killer following the shooting are not known with certainty, it is believed that he may have initially fled in a southerly direction, crossing 7th and 6th Streets, passing below these elevated rail lines, and continuing south on St. James Court alleyway. The killer's flight may have been witnessed by employees standing at the rear of the Parkersburg Sentinel building. This location is 2 blocks south of the scene of the shooting, and the distance could have been traversed by foot in as little as 1 minute. No physical description of the individual observed by the Sentinel employees has ever been made public, save for the fact that it was most likely a Caucasian male. It is important to keep in mind that the nature and layout of the surrounding neighborhood has changed considerably since the night of the shooting. In 1965, the Burger Boy Food-O-Rama was located at the present site of this WVU medical building. At the time, a cluster of 6 private homes sat due south of the restaurant, with St. James Court alleyway passing them to the east. To the north, along 8th Street, sat another cluster of private homes and businesses which have since been demolished. The many extensions to the Camden Clark Medical Center had not yet been constructed, and the block was, at the time, occupied by 3 businesses and 1 other private home. All of these locations would have had a direct line-of-sight view of either the shooting itself or any of the killer's many possible avenues of flight. This is the immediate neighborhood as it appeared in 1968, and this is the same neighborhood as it appears today. The clusters of homes and businesses which have since been demolished were located here, here, and here. The roadways, elevated railway lines, the Parkersburg Community Bank building, and the building which formerly housed the Esso service station remain as they were in 1965. Please take a moment to examine these images and familiarize yourself with the neighborhood's former and current layout. If you have any information concerning the shooting death of Garry Ross Cowdery, please contact the Parkersburg, West Virginia Police Department at 304-424-8444.